This bill amends the referendum machinery to align with the Electoral Act. I'm generally satisfied that the tidying up and modernising aspects of this bill are necessary and appropriate, and I agree with them. There are, however, three aspects of the bill on which I have significant concerns. In summary, they relate to the provisions relating to financial disclosure and how these will interact with the current JSCEM inquiry into disclosure thresholds and real-time disclosure of political donations generally, both in relation to federal elections and federal referenda. If we know that system is broken, why repeat it now for the referendum? Secondly, the government's suspension of the Section 11.4 and the lack of detail on its recently reported about face on a pamphlet for a yes and no campaign. When such pamphlets will be distributed and what fact-checking will be made required in relation to the content of those pamphlets. And why this bill does not address truth in political advertising and referenda advertising, in particular the issues set out in my Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Stop the Lies Bill 2022. So I am surprised that this bill includes matters relating to financial disclosure, which are currently the subject of the JSCEM inquiry into the 2022 election. The JSCEM inquiry is, amongst other things, tasked with considering reforms to political donation laws, particularly the applicability of real-time disclosure and a reduction of the disclosure threshold to a fixed $1,000. So I agree with Dr Paul Kildea of University of New South Wales that the bill's regulation of referendum donations and spending is well overdue, but that in replicating the political finance provisions of the Electoral Act, this bill and these amendments are adopting the problems of a high disclosure threshold and not requiring real-time disclosure. So we know there is a problem, and in one of the most significant questions we are going to put to the Australian people, we are embedding and replicating the very problems we know that mar our election process. The pamphlets. On the subject of the suspension of Section 11.4, the Minister claims that instead of issuing pamphlets or funding a yes or no campaign, the government will fund civics education in relation to the upcoming referendum on the voice, including providing voters with a good understanding of Australia's constitution, the referendum process and factual information about the referendum proposal. There's no detail given as to what this will entail or when it will be implemented. And I note that also on the 8th of February this year, the Finance Minister confirmed that existing laws requiring a pamphlet for both sides would be maintained. Despite this, the explanatory memorandum states, temporary suspension of 11.4 will ensure that there is more than one way to communicate with electors before a referendum and allows parliamentarians to choose how and when to engage with their relevant constituency. The intent of the government was to offload engagement with constituents to individual parliamentarians and the private sector to navigate the maelstrom. This was and is particularly concerning for independent members of Parliament in particular, who already are stretched within very thin with resources. So I call on the Minister to give more detail about the timing of the issue of this yes and no pamphlets and the extent to which it's now intended that individual parliamentarians will bear the burden of disseminating the government's civics education as well as delivering the yes and no pamphlets. It does beg the broader question of how much our education system is actually failing in that civics education when it comes to Australian people actually understanding the Australian Constitution and the role a referendum plays in that. It just shows that we still have a low level of literacy, of constitutional literacy, in understanding our systems of government and how it works. What we do know is the lack of regulation around misleading and deceptive content in political elections, but also in referendums, erodes trust. It means that you have a standard that is below the standard the Australian people expect in business and commerce. We have regulation in those sectors. But for these questions of elections, of referendums, where we are really debating, the Australian people are being asked to vote on incredibly important questions, there's no protections. It's a free-for-all. And there is an opportunity before the government to ensure that there is, in fact, that fact-checking, and it really should happen. Prior to Christmas, I tabled the bill known as the Commonwealth Electoral Amendment Stop the Lies Bill 2022. Various iterations of this have been debated for years. We know this is needed. This is overwhelmingly supported by conservative and progressive voters, left and right alike. They feel cheated by the system, that there is no regulation around political advertising. The bill that I presented had been drafted deliberately to extend to both elections and referenda. The Stop the Lies bill must be taken into account in scheduling the order of these bills, so that the very important issue of truth in political advertising is addressed before the consideration of the government's bill. The terms of reference for the JSCAM inquiry into the 2022 election consideration of the potential for truth in political advertising laws to enhance the integrity and transparency of the electoral system. So I note that the JSCAM advisory report on this bill, delivered only some weeks ago, declined to recommend establishing a truth in political advertising regime, saying that the forthcoming referendum is not the right time, given that the JSCAM inquiry into the 2022 election has not yet published its report. So we know there's a problem. We're about to ask the Australian people to respond to one of the most essential questions and next step in our reconciliation journey. This will have a mark on Australia for years to come, and yet the government knows it needs to protect truth and is failing to do that. It's nonsensical. The government is intent on pressing ahead with this bill before the outcome of the JSCAM 2022 election inquiry, and yet really has not delivered any information on how it is going to ensure that there is no misleading and deceptive content in either the yes or no pamphlets, but also at large in the debate. If this isn't the right time on a question of such importance that we're putting to the Australian people, when will be? The proposed referendum is already generating a substantial amount of energetic debate, and divisions are appearing, which are not only following political party lines, but also creating divisions within and outside political parties. And it's incredibly important that we have open public discussion. That is an incredibly important thing as part of a democracy. But the potential is clearly out there that in an environment for passion to override moderation, but also for false and misleading statements to be made. We know there's already been that in relation to the referendum. Legislation like Stop the Lies is needed more than ever, and it's needed now. And we really need to address this. Australians know they face an incredibly important question this year. It's one long overdue. We can't undo the past, but we certainly can all take responsibility for the future we want to create for Australia. What do we stand for as a nation? For my part, and for many in Warringah, I know we have a deep-seated desire to ensure that there is constitutional recognition for First Nations people, that we must do better in closing the gap, that what we have done for so many years has failed to close the gap, and that we must address this simple question of better listening to communities, ensuring policies that are going to directly impact First Nations people, that they are actually with their advice, that they are actually listening to them and understanding the impact they will have. So I welcome this bill to amend the referendum provisions. There's no doubt that there is no... the bill as it is currently drafted is for another century. It's another era, and voters, it needs to be updated. But there are some key areas that really haven't been addressed by the government. And for me, that's sloppy, because at the end of the day, we don't want to be looking back after the debate on the referendum and go, oh, this debate's been marred by so much misleading and deceptive content. If only we had done something about fact-checking, stopping those false claims being made as to the effect of the amendment that's proposed in the Constitution. If only we had done that. Well, I call on the government to really do that at this point, that it's important we protect this process. We mustn't have an erosion of trust in the referendum. It really is so important that we get this right, and it means you have to tick all the boxes, not just some or the easier one or the more obvious ones. The process has started in Warringah. I've distributed already information about how referendums work, information about the draft motion and the draft proposed amendments to the Constitution. And people are incredibly keen to understand and engage in this debate. They want to listen to experts. They want to listen to First Nations people. And that's why it's so exciting that there's going to be a forum in Warringah coming up in April with Dean Parkin, so that we can really talk about the importance of this decision for all Australians. This is not just a responsibility for First Nations and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. This is a responsibility on all Australians. We all have a responsibility of what kind of nation we want to be. Do we want to take that next step of reconciliation? And so I urge the government to go all the way, to make sure we have a fair and respectful debate, and to make sure that we stamp out misleading and deceptive facts, so that this referendum, we can be proud of its process and proud of its outcome.